critical race theory. You've almost certainly heard about it, and it's been in the news a lot recently, with some states and school boards even banning the teaching of it in K through 12 schools. And just hearing the term critical race theory probably made you have an emotional response of some kind. I know it did for me. But I also realized I couldn't actually tell you what critical race theory really meant. So I tried to learn more for myself, and the more I read what different legislation was actually banning and what critics of critical race theory said it was, the more I realized it didn't match up with what scholars of and advocates for critical race theory were actually proposing. It seemed that people were getting pretty upset about and outright banning ideas that weren't critical race theory, and at least in my understanding, were oftentimes the exact opposite of what critical race theory seemed to support. But I didn't really have much experience with this. So I reached out to Sean Darling Hammond, who has studied critical race theory and has some background in this topic, to try to learn what critical race theory actually is, if it's being taught in our schools, and if critical race theory really can help to reduce bias and make our society more inclusive. So, Sean, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about critical race theory, which is something that I hadn't really heard about until maybe about a year ago, and now suddenly it seems to be everywhere and also seems to be a pretty emotionally charged topic. So yeah. Thank you for being here and for taking this chance to talk with me about it. I really appreciate it.
For sure. My pleasure.
Yeah. So just as a little bit of background for you, you've got quite a bit of relevant background to this. It seems like you studied sociology in your undergrad, you went to law school, and now you're getting your PhD studying diversity, equity, inclusion, education, all kinds of different stuff. Can you just tell me a little bit more about your background with this?
Sure, yeah, and like you, I actually did not know a thing about critical race theory before I went to law school. So, I'd worked in other critical studies areas, but I hadn't looked at critical race theory specifically. And I actually had the benefit of having a professor who taught critical race theory. And in taking his class, he decided to bring me on a research team as we were doing writing a book called Dog Whistle Politics. It was kind of a critical race book, but I came into it like I come into almost any academic subdiscipline with the same skepticism that I think we're seeing in society more broadly. But I think hopefully I can sort of bridge be a bridge for folks between where they are in their understanding of the topic and sort of what it really is and what it's really used for and why it's considered as valuable as anthropology or sociology or psychology or other sort of disciplines that people use to study things.
Gotcha. Perfect. Well, in that case, I think the best question to start with is just what is critical race theory and what does that term actually mean?
Yeah, and I think to define it, there's actually another sort of bigger umbrella you need to define, which is critical legal studies. So before the advent of what are called critical legal studies, we thought that everything in the law was objective and accurate and good, right? So any law that was out there landed on everybody the same way. That was a belief that folks had, in the Enlightenment era, in the 1800s. Then critical legal studies came along, and we started to wonder if a given law might not land equally on all members of society. And just think, this is like the 1800s. We weren't the most progressive species at the time, right? So had a lot to learn. But that was a really big moment of epiphany for humanity, where we started to look at the way that a given statute or regulation or policy might work really well for one group of people, but might actually put another group of people at a severe disadvantage or leave them, with really bad outcomes, right? So that's critical legal studies. So if you look at, for example, studies of where polling places are and how that might impact folks' ability to vote. That's kind of a critical legal studies question, right? So should we be putting polling places in every community so every community has access to that First Amendment right to vote? Or is it okay to put all the polling places on one side of town and none on the other side, right? That's critical legal studies. And I think there's not a whole lot of confusion about why that's a useful way to approach things. Critical race theory is a subcategory of critical legal studies that looks at sort of the racial impacts of policies, of statutes, of regulations, and ask the question, is there something about the way that we've structured society that puts a given racial group at a disadvantage or leads to disparities in outcomes? So if you look at, Brown versus Board of Education and desegregation literature, that's really sort of very aligned with the critical race theory question of, is there something about our education system that is putting a specific racial group at a disadvantage? And if you look at sort of the set of scholarship that's come out of analyses of Brown and the progeny of Brown, those cases, a lot of that's critical race theory. It's just asking, is there something we can do to make our society more structurally fair at a structural level, sort of at the level of what are the building blocks of our legal structures?
Gotcha. Okay. So it seems like critical race theory is a subset of critical legal theory, and it's kind of, I don't know, maybe you could view it as like sort of a lens of looking at how laws will disproportionately affect different people, and in this case, how race plays into that. Is that
Exactly. Yep. And there are some sort of like interesting subtenets. I mean, I'll just elevate one, which I think is really important. And it's really, I think, one of the most important contributions of critical race theory to the broader panoply of academic studies, which is you can't really understand what's happening for a community unless you talk to members of that community. That was not the prevailing norm in research in the 60s, 70s, 80s, right? Like it was completely acceptable to have a deficit orientation to stratification studies. So if you were trying to understand why are Black students performing less well on standardized tests, the deficit orientation is what's wrong with Black people, right? But the critical race approach is let's talk to Black people. Let's figure out what's going on in their lives, in their communities, and figure out if there's something that's different for Black communities and for white communities. And when you do that, you find out all sorts of sources of disadvantage. You know, one of the most sort of like weird small ones was people were wondering why Black students were performing less well on very, very early tests of IQ. And it turned out Black students were more likely to have vision impairment that was undiagnosed. So you had little kids who couldn't see the questions on the test, right? Literally couldn't see, they couldn't answer the question because they couldn't see it. But no one knew that because they weren't asking Black parents, what's going on for you? And, you know, you ask about parents, they say, well, I feel like my kid can't read well, but we have no way of getting an eye check. We have no way of getting glasses. And so, you know, they just go in and take these tests and do the best they can. So like that's an example of how critical race theory sort of pushes other disciplines like psychology and sociology and econometrics and economics to do better and sort of elevate their methods in a little way. But it is sort of like a sub-discipline in its own way.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So it is sort of like, it's something that can be studied in and of itself, but it's also something that can be applied very broadly to a whole bunch of other different topics.
Exactly.
As well.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay. So I've been looking a little bit into sort of just like what I guess other people have said about critical race theory. And it sounds very different than a lot of things that you've described. And so I just kind of want to ask you about some of those different things where like some of the big things that I've heard is this idea that critical race theory divides people into the oppressors and the oppressed, and that it also reinforces the idea of race essentialism, which is, I guess, kind of the idea that like race is this biological fact and that certain things are just definitively true about people who belong to a race.
That's so funny. Yeah, I'll take those in opposite order because the second one's easier. So one of the critical tenets of critical race theory is actually that race is socially constructed. So the idea that, you know, racial essentialism is a tenet of CRT is like I don't know how someone gets there. But sort of even the most foundational and most recent critical race scholarship emerges from the orientation that there's nothing unique about one group of people versus another. And all of the sort of disparity or difference or distinction that we observe or believe is socially constructed. And if you take that lens, then you start to think, well, if people are at root similar and there are these disparities in outcomes, then it must be a function of society, right? You can't actually get to like the basic architecture of CRT unless you agree that race is socially constructed, because otherwise you could just say, oh, well, certain groups do more poorly because they're biologically different. But that's like the baseline assumption of CRT is that is not the case. So biological essentialism, that's easy to dispel. The other is sort of like the notion that there is a permanency to racial hierarchy or stratification. That's a little more tricky, right? Because it depends on what kind of CRT you're looking at and what context you're looking at it in. So if you're looking at CRT, like critical Latin studies, critical trans studies, critical race theory, sort of the panoply of critical studies, then there's a lot of fluidity in which sort of structures are at play and how they might generate stratification. And so there's no kind of prevailing theory or orientation that people come to the world with. With critical race theory in the US context, so much of it is rooted in understanding the legacy of slavery. So there is a tendency to, I think rightly, study things with a lens towards how do current structures that are vestiges of slavery and of Jim Crow perpetuate stratification that elevates the opportunities of whites and relegates the opportunities of Blacks to the back of the bus, you know, metaphorically speaking. I think that's not a crazy way to approach things if you think of the way that society continues to be structured. And if you look into any sort of hard-nosed study of structural racism and its impacts in education and housing, in health, you will find that the legacy of Jim Crow and the legacy of slavery is still relatively perceptible in our legal structures. And it's something that's getting better all the time, but I think, it is fair to say that if people are feeling like, oh, CRT in the U.S. context has this sort of like very specific narrative around the outcomes of slavery down the line, that is true. That is very true. That is something that CRT scholars are very interested in.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay, that's definitely interesting. What about sort of the idea that CRT is focusing more on, again, systems as opposed to individuals? As I'm sort of going through a whole bunch of, and we'll get to this idea of a lot of bills being passed, limiting the teaching of different tenets of CRT in schools, that most of the points they bring up are focused on, individuals shall not be made to feel this, or individuals won't be taught this. And my understanding is that CRT is much more about sort of the systemic side of it and less about the individual. Is that the case?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's been fascinating to me. I was actually just on the phone with a former student of mine who teaches in Atlanta. He was a public school teacher in Atlanta. And he was saying, why are they trying to outlaw CRT? We're out here just trying to teach math. Like, we're not trying to indoctrinate anybody. This is just sort of legislation out of left field for political gain. That's how it felt for him as a teacher in a district that has like diversity and where these issues could be an issue but aren't. But yeah, when you really think about what CRT is focused on, it's focused on questions of like, as I mentioned before, is it fair to have polling places on one side of town but not on the other? Like, that says nothing about individual voters and their sort of the value of their vote. That says nothing about, individual politicians or even parties, political parties. It just says, it seems unfair that all the areas where Black people live have fewer polling places. Could this be a product of a structure, a legal structure that generates stratification in society? And if so, why does that structure exist? And how can we, innovate better structures? That's like a very kind of vanilla question. It's not that exciting or crazy or incendiary. It's just critical of the structures that exist from the lens of what drives racial stratification. In other words, critical race. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's just a lot of misunderstanding. My guess is that when people hear critical race theory, they feel like it's some kind of like Black supremacy or some kind of like excuse to talk down to white folks, but that's not at all what it is. And in fact, one of the most, I think, beneficial aspects of critical race theory and critical studies generally is nobody is free of critique, right? So many critical race scholars will critique one another and say, like, your scholarship is going to exacerbate disparities in these ways and those ways. And so you need to be more, circumspect and careful about the way you analyze this. And that's like a Black person to another Black person, right? So I think it's important to realize that the goal is always to understand whether the structures in society are fair and may or may not be driving racial stratification. That's not about one racial group or another. That's really about the structures, as you said.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. So kind of getting to this idea that, again, probably why a lot of people have heard about CRT now is this idea, critical race theory, is this idea that they're worried about it being taught in public schools. That's obviously what a lot of these bills that are being passed through are kind of worried about. I guess the question is critical race theory, it sounds like it's a decently complicated topic. It's a decently complex way of looking at things in a lot of ways. Is it actually being taught in K through 12 schools? And then if so, in what way, if it actually is?
Let me use an analogy here. Let's think. Okay. So is constitutional law taught in schools? The short answer is kind of, right? We do learn that there is this thing called the Constitution and we get our rights from it. But if I asked a 12th grade graduating senior to argue under the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment for the expansion of educational opportunities for students in California, they'd be like, what? So yes, we do teach critical race theory in the sense that we teach very simple concepts that I think are largely very well socially accepted. The ones I mentioned before, like we shouldn't have unfair social structures that put one race at a disadvantage. That's, to be fair, that's kind of that's not something that springs from critical race theory and the way that we look at structures to make sure that they're not creating that kind of stratification. That's a critical race concept, right? So yeah, we do in some context do teach that kind of critical lens to students in high school and in middle school. We're not like teaching them, like these extraordinarily knobby concepts like interest conversion theory, which is like the Derek Bellian concept. We're not teaching them like really complex stuff that can be more difficult to understand or appreciate the nuance of, right? At least I haven't seen that kind of stuff taught.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you're teaching some of the sort of like underpinnings of critical race theory, and then some of the things that conclusions that could be derived from critical race theory, but the actual main thing is a sort of more advanced topic in many ways. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I would put it more like this. In the same way that, okay, maybe here's a better example. Mm-hmm. We teach students that there's a thing called the brain. We teach them that the way that our brains interact with society can make us feel certain things. That's basically psychology, social psychology, and sociology. Those are basic concepts in those fields, right? We don't teach them, Zimbardo prison experiments, which are much harder to swallow and much more complex, right? We don't teach them really kind of uncomfortable theories in psychology and sociology that can be very, very conflict provoking. We don't teach them that stuff because it takes a level of nuance and an appreciation of the depth of the topic that you really don't get to until you're probably already through college, right? In the same way, we do, I think, in many instances, teach the basic aspects of critical legal studies and critical race theory. We always have, because we want to have a fair society and we want students to come out of high school appreciating fairness as an aspiration for a society and understanding the pathway to fairness. And that means being critical of the way things are and trying to make things better, right? Those are basic concepts of crit, right? But we don't get into some of the things that can cause debates, not just in society, but between critical race scholars, right? And I think what's happening now is folks are cherry picking really incendiary aspects of critical race scholarship, which are heavily debated within the crit community, and saying like, this is what crit is, when really nobody would ever teach those things in high school, in the same way that I wouldn't go to a high school and teach some of the really interesting and incendiary and sometimes problematic, sometimes revolutionary stuff that's coming out of psychology or sociology or econ, right? Like you go deep in any field and you'll find something that's like, that doesn't align with the current tenets of society, because it's not meant to, right? Like we're supposed to go deep, deep, deep into these fields so we can try to find the truth. Sometimes we get it wrong and then we have to peel it back and argue with each other and figure it out. But the stuff that's at the foundational level of, I think, any major academic discipline is pretty straightforward. And that's true of crit as well.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So it's the sort of thing that, yes, it is being taught, but the stuff that is being taught is pretty sort of, I guess, self-evident in many cases, or pretty uncontroversial in terms of.
Yeah, and you can't imagine what it would look like to teach civics without teaching that stuff. Like imagine teaching civics and having to tell people everything in society is perfect. Don't be critical of it. All the legislation that has ever been passed is good. And the only reason we passed legislation that upended other legislation was because we got bored. Like, no, you have to teach it from a standpoint of things aren't perfect. Things can create unfairness, injustice, stratification. We need to do better. Like, that's actually like, that's who we are as a people, as Americans. We want to constantly improve on this experiment of democracy. If we don't teach civics that way and history that way, like what are we even teaching? Then it's just like memorizing random stuff that happens to be true right now. So yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's like the deeper you go into understanding what crit is foundationally, the more you realize like, oh, it's kind of basic and not something you'd really argue about, and that's exactly what we're teaching in schools.
Gotcha. I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess really kind of one quick thing to finish off with is that you do a lot of research into sort of this idea of education and diversity, equity, and inclusion. What sorts of things actually do help in educational settings to reduce bias, or help in workplace settings to reduce bias? And what is the overlap with critical race theory?
It's a great question. So yeah, I mean, I don't think the work I do now would exist as a subdiscipline of academia absent the work of critical race scholarship or the work of critical race scholars in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So what I study is how can we create social structures that empower individuals of all backgrounds to thrive and to connect across stale social divides. And an example of that is, I have a few lines of work that are on this topic, so I'm trying to pick one that's like the most palatable, but also like the easiest to digest, but also the most obviously related to crit. So I've done work on how we can reduce racial bias in society and ensure that people of all backgrounds feel connected to members of other social groups. And it turns out that one of the things that's most effective at sort of reducing interracial social distance is interracial contact. So having individuals of other races in contact with you, right? The prevailing theory around that for many, many years was that if you have people in too close of proximity, that will cause some kind of like resource competition. And so you'll actually get more racial distance if you have, for example, recent immigrants to the US from one country coming into a community that is not of that background. So you'll have like, oh, well, we want to have access to the good schools and the good business. But that actually does not to be the case. So my research looks at what happens when you have workplaces that become more diverse over time. And when they do, you see anti-Black bias among whites diminish pretty markedly and steadily. What's more interesting, though, is what can we do to create workplace environments where that kind of debiasing effect from diversity is accelerated? And it turns out it's all about collaboration. So just sitting, sort of shoulder to shoulder with somebody of a different racial group doesn't necessarily tear down the biases that I have about members of the group they belong to. Working in collaboration with them, however, does. Right. So if you're thinking about this from the perspective of like, what can I do as a CEO or what can I do as a legislator? It's about encouraging collaboration between racial groups. Right. So structuring our social arrangements so you don't just have like all the people in one department being Black and all the people in another department being white and all the people in another part of town being Asian. It's like, how can we create intentional collaboration and collaborative opportunities? Right. So for a CEO, that's easy. You staff projects all the time. If you're staffing a project and you've got two equally capable people and adding one person to the team would make it homogenous and adding another would make it more diverse, just go with the more diverse option because you're going to get that collaborative energy and you're also going to reduce the amount of bias. And it turns out as you reduce bias, you increase the extent to which people want to be at work, you increase the duration that they'll stay at their jobs, you increase their sort of sense of purpose in their work, you increase the quality of their work. And sort of there's a set of briefs that are done every 3 or 4 years around sort of which firms are doing the best and whether diversity is a marker of sort of productivity, and it is, right? So you also serve your bottom line by thinking that way. So yeah, that's the kind of research that I do, and we wouldn't even be asking these questions of like, how can we reduce bias in society? Do our social arrangements have a role to play in creating a society in which we can connect across the social divides? We wouldn't even be asking that if not for credit. You can't even get there unless you're critical of existing social arrangements and hopeful that there are ways to improve them and aspirational about what can be. So,
gotcha. So it seems like to sort of even be doing that work of trying to reduce bias or making things better, you essentially do need to be critical in the first place, and that's where it comes in.
Exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha. All right. Well, yeah, I think that's been really helpful. Sean, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me about this. Do you have any sort of closing thoughts, any final things about like the idea of critical race theory, what people should know about it, or any additional resources that people could go and check out if they want to learn more?
Yes, I shared with you one American Bar Association sort of summary of critical race theories, which I think it does a good job, at least in the first half. I would just say, don't get your information from social media on academic topics. I can imagine for you as like a fellow academic, you cannot imagine how frustrating it would be if people were getting all their information about like biological concepts just from social media and like politically charged social media at that. Do your own sort of even-keeled research, talk to people. If you have people around you who work on this stuff, talk to them. Because, as I said, when I was in law school, I'd already gotten my BA from Harvard. Like you'd think I would have known something about I knew nothing. I knew literally nothing about critical race theory, right? It wasn't until my third year in my JD where I got exposed and I understood what it was. And I was completely off. Like my understanding of it was completely inaccurate, right? So I think everybody has some role to play in their own lives and try to educate themselves about what this stuff is and trying not to listen to the most attractive voices, right? Like the people who speak loudest and who make you feel good when you listen to them may not be the people who know what they're talking about. So just, slow down, learn about it yourself, make your own opinions, and just know that any major political issue, at least this has been my experience, the deeper I go into academia, is riddled with inaccuracies and fallacies and, people posturing for their own political goals, right? So learn it for yourself, like you don't have a political agenda, so learn it for yourself and ignore people who have a political agenda because they're not you. They're not living your life.
Gotcha. Yeah. So make sure you go and learn what critical race theory is for yourself and don't just listen to other people who explain what it is to you.
Yeah, exactly. Except for me,
except of course for you, Sean. Yes. Well, yeah. Awesome. Sean, thank you so much for talking to me. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Eric. And great to reconnect, man.
Yeah, you too.